I was 74 years old when I heard my own children deciding the rest of my life without me. It was an ordinary Tuesday, late October, in the kitchen of the house where I had raised all three of them. The same kitchen where I had baked birthday cakes, graded spelling tests late into the night, and cried quietly after my husband, Robert, died of a heart attack 6 years earlier. I was in the hallway, about to walk in, when I heard my oldest daughter, Diane, say something that stopped me cold in my tracks. "She can't keep living alone, Mark. Did you see how she left the stove on last week?" I had left the stove on, yes, for maybe 10 minutes while I answered a call from my neighbor about her dog getting loose. It wasn't senility. It was life happening, the way life always happens. "I know," Mark answered, my middle child, always the practical one. "But she'll never agree to go somewhere like that. You know, Mom." Then my youngest, Karen, who had always been the gentlest of the three, said the sentence I carried with me for months afterward. "Maybe we don't even need to ask her. We just decide and explain it to her later." I stood frozen in the dark hallway of my own house, listening to my 3 grown children discuss which nursing home had the best reviews on Google, which one was closest to each of them, and how much it would cost per month. Nobody mentioned my name with any warmth. They mentioned me the way you mention a logistics problem, a piece of furniture that needed to be relocated. I was 74 years old. I had taught elementary school for 31 years. I had raised 3 children practically on my own for years because Robert drove trucks for a living and was gone for weeks at a time. I had buried my husband, my mother, my father, and 2 brothers. And there I was, being discussed as if I were no longer even in the room. I walked slowly back to the guest room, where I was staying that weekend, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, looking at my own hands. Hands that had held crayons, bandaged skinned knees, held Robert's hand while he took his last breath. Hands that, apparently, were no longer trustworthy enough to run my own life. I didn't cry that night. That came later. That night I just sat there, feeling a cold, quiet anger build inside me, mixed with something I hadn't felt in a long time: determination. Because the truth was this: I wasn't sick. I didn't have dementia. I had no mobility problems. I was simply alone in a house too big for one person, in a small town in Pennsylvania, where my closest neighbors had either moved away or passed on, and my children, busy with their own lives, had decided the easiest solution was to tuck me away somewhere tidy, safe, and convenient for them. That was the night the idea began to take shape. I can't say exactly when it turned into a decision, but I know that 3 months later, I was sitting in the Philadelphia airport, 2 blue suitcases at my feet, and a one-way ticket to Manila in my hand. Let me back up a little. I was born and raised in Pennsylvania. I taught 7- and 8-year-olds for 31 years at a small public school. The kind of school where everyone knew everyone, where parents would stop me in the grocery store decades later to tell me their now-grown children still remembered Mrs. Walker. I married Robert at 23. We had Diane, then Mark, then Karen. We built a modest but full life: family holidays, Sunday dinners, a dog named Buster who lived to be 15. When Robert died, I was 68. The first 2 years after were the hardest of my life. I didn't know how to sleep alone in a room that for 45 years had been shared. I didn't know how to make coffee for one without feeling the emptiness of the extra mug I still reached for out of habit. My children were attentive back then, calling often, visiting on weekends. But slowly, as it always happens, their lives returned to their normal rhythm, and mine stayed frozen. Diane lived in Ohio, married, with 2 teenage kids and a demanding accounting job. Mark lived 40 minutes from me, but worked so much he barely had time for his own family, let alone visiting his widowed mother. Karen lived in Florida, and though she was the warmest on the phone, she was also the one who showed up in person the least. I got used to the loneliness. I won't pretend it was a happy loneliness. It was just the loneliness life had handed me, and I had learned to fill it with library books, the garden I kept in the backyard, and the crochet group that met on Thursdays at church, until one by one, the women in that group either passed away or moved closer to their own children. And then came that Tuesday in October and the conversation in the hallway that changed everything. For the next few days, I pretended I hadn't heard anything. I smiled at my children at the following Sunday dinner. I asked Mark about work, asked Diane about her kids' grades, asked Karen about her new boyfriend. But inside, I was calculating. For the first time in years, I was thinking strategically about my own life. I started slowly. I did research at the public library because I didn't want it showing up in my own laptop's history in case Diane, who sometimes helped with my online accounts, decided to take a look. I searched cheap countries for American retirees to live alone. The Philippines came up again and again. Warm climate, low cost of living, a population that speaks English, a retirement visa relatively accessible for people over 50. At first, it seemed crazy even to me. 74 years old, never lived outside the United States, never traveled alone anywhere except a teachers' conference in Chicago decades earlier. But the more I read, the less absurd the idea seemed, and the more it felt like the only way out of a path that other people had already drawn for me. I spent weeks watching videos of other retirees who had made the move. A divorced woman who moved to Cebu, a widow who went to Bonifacio Global City alone at 68, a couple who had lived near Manila for 8 years and said things like, "We just got tired of putting life off." Each story gave me a little more courage. I started making secret spreadsheets, the way only a former teacher knows how. Rent costs, food, health care, travel insurance, visa extensions. I learned I could enter on a tourist visa as long as I had an onward ticket and extend my stay while I decided whether it truly felt like home. I didn't have to commit to anything permanent right away. That gave me a sense of relief I hadn't felt in years, the sense that I still had choices. The hardest part wasn't the logistics. It was deciding what to do with the house. Robert and I had bought that house in 1987. Every room held a memory. The pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where I measured the kids' height. The garden where Robert planted an apple tree the year Karen was born. The couch where we watched movies together on Sundays. Selling it would look, to anyone on the outside, like a betrayal of memory itself. But I had learned, in that dark hallway in October, that memories don't live in the walls. They live in me, and I could carry them anywhere in the world. I hired a local realtor, a woman named Sherry, who had sold my neighbor's house years before. She was surprised when I explained I wanted to sell quickly, even if it meant a slightly lower price. I didn't explain the real reason. I just said I was simplifying my life. Giving things away took longer emotionally than any other part of the move. I spent weeks sorting 40 years of belongings into 3 piles: what I would take, what I would donate, what I would give my children. I donated furniture to the church. I gave away the piano, which nobody had touched in years, to the school where I had taught. I kept photographs, letters from Robert, my mother's wedding ring, and very little else. In the end, everything I would bring to the Philippines fit into 2 medium-sized blue suitcases. 40 years of life, reduced to 50 pounds each. I told my children only 2 weeks before I flew out. I gathered the 3 of them on a video call. Diane from Ohio, Mark from his own car in the work parking lot, Karen from Florida, and said, in the calmest voice I could gather, "I sold the house. I'm moving to the Philippines. My flight is on the 15th. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the chaos. "Mom, this is insane," Diane said first, her voice already rising. "You don't even speak the language there." "They speak English, Diane. It's one of the official languages." "That's not the point," she went on. "You're going to live alone on the other side of the world with no one to help if something happens." Mark tried a more rational approach, which was typical of him. "Mom, have you thought about healthcare costs? What if you need an emergency hospital? Do you even know anyone there?" "I've already researched all of that, Mark. There are excellent hospitals in Manila, some even better than the ones here." Karen, to my surprise, was the harshest of all. "This is about that conversation you overheard, isn't it?" she asked, and for a second I almost snapped back in anger, but I held myself back. "This is about me deciding how I want to live the rest of my life," I answered, with a firmness I didn't even know I still had inside me. "You discussed my future in a kitchen, without me, as if I no longer had any say in it. I heard everything, Karen, and I decided I still have the right to choose my own path." Nobody said anything for a long moment. I could see, even through the small screen, Karen's face change. Not with anger, but with something closer to shame. They tried to talk me out of it for the next 2 weeks. Calls, texts, even a surprise visit from Mark, who showed up at my door one Saturday morning with brochures from 3 different long-term care facilities, just for me to consider all the options, he said. I politely refused to even look at them. On the day I left, only Karen came to the airport to say goodbye. We stood there, between the check-in line and the boarding gate, and she hugged me tight, crying. "I'm scared I'll never see you again, Mom." "You will see me," I answered, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It'll just be in a different city than you imagined." I didn't know in that moment whether I was being brave or completely reckless, probably both at once. The flight to Manila took 18 hours, with a layover in Tokyo. I spent most of the time staring out the little window, feeling my stomach turn every time I thought about what I was doing. 74 years old, alone, on the other side of the world. Not fluent in a single local dialect, just trusting that English would be enough. When the plane finally landed in Manila, it was almost midnight. The heat hit me like a wall the moment the airport doors opened. A heavy, humid heat, completely different from the dry Pennsylvania autumn I had left behind. The noise was different too. Horns, voices, the engines of dozens of taxis waiting outside. I stood frozen for a second, gripping my suitcase handle, feeling a wave of panic climb up my throat. What had I done? A driver I had hired in advance was waiting with a handwritten sign that read, "Patricia Walker." That somehow calmed me a little. The fact that even in all that chaos, someone knew my name and was waiting for me. The apartment I had rented was in a neighborhood called Bonifacio Global City, or BGC, as people called it. It was small but clean, 1 bedroom, a compact kitchen, a tiny balcony where I could see the lights of the tall buildings around me. I had read months earlier that the area was considered modern and safe, popular among expats. Still, on my first night there, sitting alone on the unfamiliar bed in a strange country with the old air conditioner humming in the background, I cried the way I hadn't cried since Robert's funeral. It wasn't exactly sadness. It was the collision between the relief of finally making a decision of my own and the sheer terror of being completely alone, with no safety net, in a place where I didn't know a single living soul. In the first few days, I almost gave up. I opened the airline's website on my second day there, my finger hovering over the button to book a flight home. I stared at that screen for almost 20 minutes, my coffee already gone cold beside the laptop. My passport sat right there too, close enough to grab. All I had to do was press one button, book flight. That was it. After nearly 9,000 miles. After selling the house I had called home for 37 years. After packing everything I still wanted to keep into 2 blue suitcases. I was ready to give up before my first week in the Philippines had even ended. The days that followed were some of the loneliest of my life. I would walk the streets of BGC in the early morning, before the heat became unbearable, just to have something to do. I watched young professionals walk past me carrying laptops, mothers pushing strollers, groups of friends laughing over coffee. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. I was the only one who looked completely lost, not because I couldn't find my way. I had a map on my phone and knew exactly where I was, but because I wasn't sure anymore where I belonged. I ate most of my meals alone, at a small cafe near my building, ordering the same thing every day because it was the only item on the menu I recognized without having to ask. The waitstaff started to know me by sight, though for the first 2 weeks, none of us exchanged more than a polite nod. Back home, I imagined my children speculating about how quickly I would fail and come crawling back. I imagined Diane saying, "I told you so," over a family dinner I wasn't invited to. That imagined humiliation, more than anything else, was what kept my finger off that book flight button on my second day. Pride, I suppose, saved me before courage ever had the chance to. Then, about 10 days in, something small happened that began to shift everything. I was returning some books to a small English-language lending library, run out of the back room of a bookstore near my apartment. A habit I'd kept from my old life, since I couldn't go a week without a novel in my hands. As I was leaving, I overheard 2 women near the entrance, clearly American, talking about a Wednesday coffee group that met nearby, mostly retirees and expats who got together to talk, share advice, and simply not be alone for a few hours. I hesitated outside the door for almost 5 minutes before working up the nerve to go back in and ask about it. One of the women, a retired nurse from Oregon named Susan, smiled warmly and wrote the address down on a scrap of paper for me. "You should come. Everyone there was terrified their first month too," she said. "It gets better. I promise you, it gets better." I almost didn't go. Old habits are hard to break, and back home I had grown comfortable simply staying by myself instead of reaching out. But something about the way Susan had said, "It gets better," with such certainty, stayed with me all week. The following Wednesday, I put on the nicest blouse I had packed and walked the 8 blocks to the small cafe where the group met. I stood outside for several minutes before finally going in, my heart pounding harder than it had any right to for something as small as a cup of coffee with strangers. Inside, there were about a dozen people, mostly retirees from the United States, Canada, and Australia, spread across 2 pushed-together tables. An older man with kind eyes noticed me standing awkwardly near the door and asked if the chair across from him was free. We started talking. He told me about his grandchildren back in Michigan. I told him I had spent most of my life teaching children. Before we finished our coffee, he invited me to come back the following week, since several of his friends met there every Wednesday morning. I said yes. I'm glad I did. Those Wednesday mornings slowly became part of my routine. We talked about families, the weather, food, sometimes politics, sometimes nothing important at all. It reminded me that friendship doesn't always begin with big moments. Sometimes it starts with a simple conversation over coffee. Over the following weeks, that one Wednesday morning slowly multiplied into something bigger. Susan introduced me to a woman named Carol, a retired librarian from Texas who had been in Manila for nearly 5 years and who took me under her wing almost immediately. Carol showed me which markets had the best produce, which pharmacies would deliver medication directly to my door, and, most importantly, which parts of the city felt most like home. Carol also invited me to a free English conversation group that met every Saturday morning in the community room of a church in Makati, a short jeepney ride from BGC. It was nothing fancy. Plastic chairs, a couple of folding tables, a ceiling fan working harder than anything else in the building. Local Filipino adults came to practice conversational English with native speakers. And in exchange, I got something I hadn't realized I was starving for: the feeling of being useful again. I had spent 31 years as a teacher. Somewhere along the way, after Robert died and my days became quiet and empty, I had forgotten how much of my identity had been built around helping other people learn. Sitting in that church basement on Saturday mornings, helping a young mother practice job interview questions in English, or helping a teenager pronounce words correctly for his college entrance exam, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. By my second month, I wasn't counting the days until some imaginary flight home anymore. In fact, I had started looking for reasons to stay longer. Of course, it wasn't all smooth. There were days the humidity made my joints ache in ways the dry Pennsylvania air never had. There were days I missed watching the leaves change color in autumn, missed the particular quiet of a Pennsylvania snowfall, missed my old church, my old grocery store, the sound of my own language spoken with the accents I'd grown up around. There were holidays, Thanksgiving especially, when being so far from my children and grandchildren felt unbearably heavy, and I sat alone in my apartment with a small plate of food that in no way resembled the Thanksgivings of my past, crying quietly into a paper napkin. There were also more practical frustrations. Paperwork for my visa extension took far longer than I expected, requiring 3 separate trips to an immigration office where the lines stretched out the door. I misunderstood simple things sometimes because of language and cultural differences, tipping customs, appropriate greetings, how bargaining worked at the local markets. More than once I overpaid for something simply because I didn't yet understand how transactions worked outside of a fixed-price American supermarket. But slowly, month by month, those frustrations became smaller, and the moments of unexpected joy became bigger. I remember one particular afternoon, about 4 months in, when I was walking home from my Saturday conversation group and caught myself smiling for no particular reason at all. Nothing extraordinary had happened. I was simply happy. That realization stopped me in my tracks, right there on a crowded Makati sidewalk, motorcycles buzzing past, vendors calling out prices for mangoes and fried bananas. For months, maybe even years before that, happiness had felt tied to numbers in a retirement account, or to whether my children called on schedule, or to whether I had successfully avoided being a burden to anyone. Suddenly, standing on that sidewalk, none of that mattered. I wasn't waiting for my life to begin again. I wasn't managing the time I had left. I was simply living it. Around that time, Karen called to say she was booking a flight to Manila. Not for a vacation, she admitted honestly, but to see with her own eyes what her mother was doing on the other side of the world. I was more nervous waiting for her at the airport than I had been on my own first night landing in Manila. It's one thing to explain your choices over the phone. It's another thing entirely to have those choices standing in front of you, watching, evaluating, quietly trying to decide whether you've lost your mind. Karen hugged me so hard at the arrivals gate I could barely breathe. Then she stepped back, looked me up and down, and said something that made me laugh out loud. "You look different." "Good different or bad different?" I asked. She stared at me for a second, then shrugged. "I haven't decided yet." That was Karen, always brutally honest. The first few days of her visit felt a little like an inspection, though I don't think she intended it that way. I could see her quietly observing everything: my small apartment, the neighborhood, the people I spent time with, the places I went, the way I moved through the city with a confidence that clearly surprised her. She wasn't just visiting Manila. She was trying to understand why her mother suddenly seemed lighter, freer, and more herself than she had been in the 6 years since Robert died. I took her to my Saturday conversation group, where she watched me help a shy teenage boy practice his English pronunciation for nearly 20 minutes. Afterward, walking back to my apartment, she was quiet for a long stretch before finally saying, "I've never seen you like this, Mom. Not since before Dad got sick." I didn't say anything right away. I just let the comment settle between us, the tropical evening air thick around us, motorbikes weaving past. "I'm not running away from you kids," I finally told her. "I want you to understand that. I'm not running away from anything. I was running toward something, toward the version of myself I'd quietly set aside while taking care of everyone else for 40 years. Karen cried a little that night, sitting on my small balcony with 2 mugs of tea between us. She apologized, unprompted, for the conversation I had overheard in the hallway that October. She admitted that none of them had really thought about how it would feel to be discussed that way, like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be consulted. "We were scared," she admitted. "Scared of losing you the way we'd already lost Dad. We thought if we just made the decision for you, it would somehow protect you, protect us." "I understand that fear," I told her. "I've felt it too, watching all 3 of you grow up and leave home one by one. But protecting someone and controlling someone aren't the same thing, Karen. I needed you all to trust that I still knew how to take care of myself." By the end of her 10-day visit, Karen had softened considerably. She admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that she could see why I had made the choice I did. She still worried, she said, but it was a different kind of worry now. Less my mother has lost her mind, and more the ordinary worry any child feels about a parent living somewhere far away. When she flew home, she promised to tell Diane and Mark the truth of what she'd seen, rather than the version they had all built up in their imaginations. Slowly, over the following months, my relationship with all 3 of my children began to shift. Diane remained the most skeptical for the longest time, but even she eventually admitted during a video call nearly a year after I'd moved that I sounded happier than she remembered me sounding in years. Looking back now, nearly 2 years since that terrifying first night in Manila, I don't think the Philippines changed me. I don't think any place truly changes a person from the outside in. What it gave me was room to breathe, room to slow down, and room to remember the person I had been before fear and grief and other people's expectations became the center of every single day. I still budget carefully. I still think before I make purchases. None of that discipline, built over decades of a modest life, disappeared. But fear is no longer sitting at the center of my mornings. My attention has slowly shifted away from counting the years I have left and towards simply enjoying the days I'm living right now. People sometimes ask if moving to the Philippines solved all my problems. The honest answer is no. Things rarely work that way. I still have days when I miss home terribly. I still miss family birthdays, still feel that particular ache during the holidays when being so far away feels especially difficult. Distance has a way of reminding you what truly matters, but I no longer feel like a problem waiting to be solved by someone else's spreadsheet of nursing home reviews. I feel like a woman who, at 74 years old, packed 2 suitcases and decided her story wasn't finished being written just yet. If you're standing at the edge of a decision that scares you, I can't tell you what the right choice is. But I can tell you this. The most frightened I have ever been in my entire life was the night I sat alone on that balcony in Manila, wondering what I had done. And that same frightening night became the beginning of the happiest chapter I have ever lived. For me, that made every uncertain step worth taking.